5 years ago, all of us used BlackBerries. Now only 2 of us do. Perhaps that's a sign of the times. As RIM struggles with its future and this week's predictions for the future of Canada's former world leader in handheld technology are bleak. Tonight, something a little different for At Issue as we ponder what all this says about us as a country and us as Canadians. Andrew is in Vancouver tonight, while Chantal and Bruce are here in Toronto. Let me just show you 2 short clips, one from a documentary about a decade ago by Susan Reisler about Canadian technology, and one from Barack Obama. Watch this.
Ottawa even has a partnership with RIM. Just last week, Industry Canada invested almost $34 million to help the company speed development of its newest product.
It's very important that we have the next generation of major multinationals in this country.
No other presidential candidate has so relied on the ubiquitous Canadian-made BlackBerry or talked about it so glowingly.
I'm still clinging to my BlackBerry. They're going to pry it out of my hands.
Well, that was Barack Obama 5 years ago. I don't know whether he still uses a BlackBerry, but if he does, he never talks about it. I guess what I want to start with here is, you know, I understand, I get it, the technology changes, people want the best, and obviously a lot of people don't think it's BlackBerry anymore. But is this more than just a business story? Bruce?
Well, I think it is more than a business story, but I think it's a story that's been taking a long time to develop. I think in general, you could make the case that for 25 or 30 years, really, we've tended to invest less of our sense of national pride in major iconic companies. I remember one of the very first studies I did when I got into the public opinion business was a study about whether Canadians would go along with the acquisition by Amoco of Dome Petroleum, which was considered a Canadian jewel at the time. And what's interesting to me to think about that story now is that you wouldn't do a poll about something like that now because not very many people would have a strong opinion. Since then, of course, we privatized our national airline, our railway, our national oil company. We've seen companies that became iconic Canadian brands like Nortel in the technology space rise and ultimately fail. And it doesn't mean that we're less nationalistic, that we don't react very strongly to those events. It just means that we think about nationalism differently than around companies.
Chantal?
No, you can't tell people for 2 decades about globalism and the global market. Show them companies that become success stories by delocalizing and doing whatever they do in other countries and expect people to have the same relationship to national brands on the economic front as they would have when we had one of each good companies and they were, you know, they took our flag to the world. BlackBerry certainly was a great asset, and it's too bad that it didn't become the next Apple. But I don't think that most Canadians define who they are by virtue of a commercial product, not in the era of free trade and globalization.
Well, we'll get to that branding in a moment. Andrew, economic nationalism, is it dead?
Well, if they don't identify with companies, that's a progress, because certainly it's not for lack of trying on the part of corporate Canada, which has always, going back 100 years, has tried to encourage Canadians to identify their interests with corporate Canada's to the point of submitting to cartel arrangements, protectionism, subsidies that came out of the taxpayer's pocket, etc., and always with this appeal to patriotism, to Canadian nationalism. I mean, it's one of the oldest cons in the rather well-stocked book of cons. It is, I agree, it has been lessening in its appeal lately. You can see, for example, with the telecos who tried their darndest to get people up in a tizzy about protecting the interests of Rogers and Bell and TELUS, and even to the point of running ads saying, you know, what if somebody took over half the water supply of Canada, and trying to compare themselves to that. But I think people, it's fading, partly because people are seeing through the con, partly because I think in the particular case of technology, people understand more than most, this is a very meritocratic industry. It really is intensely competitive. Companies rise and fall all the time. And we've seen the fruits of that competition in much better products coming for much lower prices steadily over the last 20, 30 years. So I think when you look particularly at the example of BlackBerry and some of the mistakes they've made along the way, I think people will be less easily persuaded that their national interests, you know, reside in saving BlackBerry or whatever.
You know, we say that we are a nation of traders, and we are very dependent on trade, but at this point, we seem to be better at trading what other people think of than at making them ourselves. And if there is an issue that should trouble, for instance, political thinkers. It's not that they should prop up this sector or that sector. I think that's gone. I think Canadians don't see that as the way to go. But that our approach to business, and maybe in part because of the dependency, the notion of Canadian companies that, oh, should the government do something, for instance, about BlackBerry, that's part of our culture, and it doesn't serve us well. That the thinking out there is not very edgy, it's very state dependent. You know, big business in Canada likes to complain about the social safety net and the dependence of individuals on it, but they themselves have long depended on corporate welfare. And I don't think that cuts it in this environment, and I think governments are on to that.
But, so I guess what you're all suggesting is that we shouldn't be surprised that, you know, that a company that helped define us as a nation to some people, clearly around the world, internationally, on the technology front, appears to be in serious trouble, and yet nobody seems to be talking about it, or really seems to care about it. I mean, thousands of jobs have been lost, and the potential of thousands more.
Well, I think there's a few things that are going on there. I do think that people are disappointed at the demise or the difficulties that BlackBerry has encountered. But I don't think that's the same as feeling a sense of almost national shame. I think they're really quite capable of separating those two. I also feel that BlackBerry at a given point in time didn't do that much to rally the nationalism that they might have wanted to benefit from, if indeed they want to benefit from it now. But part of that is related to Chantal's point, which is that corporations generally have been saying to consumers, you need to give us the permission to do whatever we need to do to make our businesses succeed. If that means laying people off, so be it. If it means acquiring new investors from somewhere else in the world, so be it. And sometimes it means allowing them to fail. And consumers have been hearing that message over and over and over again and putting more distance between themselves as kind of nationalists, if you like, and these iconic brands.
Andrew?
Well, I mean, that's the point is, you know, we don't exist to serve the interests of corporations. They exist to serve the interests of consumers, to make products that people want to buy at prices they're willing to pay. Competition is the guarantor of that. That's what disciplines corporate self-interest and channels it towards serving the consumer interest. When we see a story like this, both on the way up, that was an encouraging news that was working with BlackBerry, that they came out of nowhere because they had a brilliant product that they marketed very well in the early stages. And when they got complacent as a result of that, and they failed to innovate, failed to keep pace with what was happening with consumers, it's also important that be the message on the way down as well. And so this is, while it's very bad news, obviously, for the people who are losing their jobs, in the systemic sense, this is a good news story. This shows that the system works, that the system is weeding out companies that aren't making products that people want to buy.
If you wanted to go back to the time when people started to step back from embracing corporate entities as branding Canada, and I think most people would reject the notion that Canada needs to be branded by a product of any kind, including a circus, which is also our trademark to the work, the Cirque du Soleil, but I'm not, you know, I don't walk around thinking a clown is my brand. I think you would go back to the bank mergers. And when the big Canadian banks failed to try to make the case to Canadians why they wanted to merge, decided this was the way to go and forget about whatever. And people were saying, well, you're closing my branch. You're raising my fees. You're not doing anything for me with my money. And you're saying that we should just let you become bigger and pay less attention to us. Remember what happened there? Well, I think from there was kind of a divorce of our soul versus corporate Canada. And I think today, for instance, Air Canada would not be able to wage the I have a flag campaign that they waged when they were in a battle to win control over Canadian Airlines. I think people would say, well, no, you know, let whoever is going to treat us best win this battle.
Well, there are counterexamples, though. If somebody tried to take over a bank, I would guess that the knee-jerk economic nationalism would kick in pretty quickly. People would feel that was very threatening somehow. We certainly saw with some of the resource sector, with the potash takeover, with the takeovers in the oil patch, you can still drum up inchoate fears over that.
But that is stuff in the ground. It's not services to consumers. I'm never going to get potash delivered, I hope, at my house.
Okay, let me be nice to potash.
Well, yes, as long as it doesn't show up on my doorstep.
Let me, I hear what you're saying about you don't want a company to define us as Canadians. But it's really not about how we see ourselves. I'm sure most Canadians would, you know, like pick Sidney Crosby, or you'd pick Chris Hadfield, or any number of things that define us. But outside of Canada, when internationally we're looked at, I don't think there's any question. A lot of people identified us with BlackBerry 5 years ago. Now, you know, it's changed. It could be the oil sands that define us to a lot of people on the international stage. How important is this?
I don't think it is terribly important in that sense, because I actually think that the images that people around the world have of countries develops over a very long period of time and doesn't change very much. So you can have these temporal things that pop up on the landscape and people say, oh, that's cool, Canada has spawned that company that's making this interesting or exciting new product. But surveys that I've seen over the years have said that most people who don't know much about Canada have a view of it, which is not that it's a technology leader, but that it's a modern economy, that it's got a strong resources base, that the people are friendly, and that they're relatively well educated. So those are kind of enduring values that people associate with and tolerant, enduring values that people associate with Canada that I think are far more important in the long term than those individual companies.
Andrew.
I'm not sure that many people outside Canada did know that BlackBerry was Canadian. I mean, maybe there's data to show the contrary, but I'd be surprised if that many people identified them with Canada. But I'm not sure we should be overly concerned with our brand, our image, our reputation, other than I'd love us to have a reputation as a well-run place that looks after its citizens well. And part of that is having a competitive economy, competitive in the sense that companies have to compete with each other for consumers' custom, rather than posing as national icons or national champions, to use that terminology, which always leads us down blind alleys. So reputation should be a secondary concern to let's run this country in as smart and as compassionate a way as we can.
You get the last word, Chantal.
Well, I'll just take you into the next chapter on Parliament Hill. There is a reason why the advanced billing that we're hearing about the Trump speech in the National Post or elsewhere is about what I call small, shiny objects, consumer-driven promises, rather than big policies about an industrial strategy for Canada. And it is because governments have picked up on this and on the mood of Canadians. And that is where they think that the attention is going. And so that is why governments are coming up to us in those terms, rather than laying out the next trade frontier that they're going to be breaking, although they do want to break another trade frontier.
All right. We're going to leave it at that. A good discussion. And you've pointed us forward to next week, because we'll probably start to get into this whole issue of reset and what the government may or may not have planned for the throne speech ahead. Andrew's in Vancouver this week. Chantal and Bruce are right here.